Welcome to today's lunchtime lesson. So we are doing a conditionals review in this session, and we've been doing lots and lots of work on conditionals in this block. We've got lots of other videos on it. So we're going to do a review of everything, a kind of overview of what we've discussed with the conditionals. If you want to have a look in more detail, then I recommend going back, watching those other lessons. Today, we're just going to kind of go through the main points that we've discussed, but obviously in the other lessons, we go into a lot more detail. So we're going to start off with seeing how much you guys can remember. And what I want you to do is I have a table here, yeah, and I want you to try and complete it, please, with as much information as you can. So I've got 4 conditionals, the 0, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd. We didn't actually do a video about the 0 conditional, but we did discuss it a little bit. And I think you guys should be fine. We're going to think first of all about the function. Remember, that's always the most important thing. So what's the purpose of using that structure? What does it express? Why am I using it? Then consider how you construct it, what the form is. And finally, think about if there's anything important that you need to consider when it comes to the pronunciation of that structure. So are any contractions happening? Do any sounds change? Things like that. Okay, so take 5 minutes, make your notes, see how much you can remember, and then we'll check. We'll go and revise everything over and summarize our answers. Okay, so if you didn't manage to get all of that in, don't worry. The gaps on your piece of paper are actually a really useful learning tool, because that's going to tell you the gaps in your knowledge and where you might want to focus. Okay, so these kind of little exercises are really helpful for you to think about, you know, what information you're not confident about or where you think we could improve. Okay, so let's begin just looking at some of the key points to discuss about 0 conditionals. So remember that we use a 0 conditional to express truths and facts, okay? And we construct that with the present aspect in our situation clause and also the present aspect in our consequence. So remember, a conditional always has a condition, right? It's got to have 2 sides. So you have the situation and the consequence of that, or the result. So for example, when water reaches 100 degrees, that's my situation, the consequence of that is it boils, okay? And that is a fact, yeah? Or if you're running a marathon, it's hard. Now, this is why I say we use present aspect. Remember, very often in a grammar book, it will tell you present simple. Language is not as easy as that. We can't just always simplify it that much. Here, for example, I'm using a present continuous construction in there, right? And it's an action in progress, but it is present aspect that I'm using. Okay, when we are talking about the 0 conditional, it's really common to see the word when, and that's because we're talking about truths and facts. So it's something that reoccurs all the time. And in terms of pronunciation, there's nothing terribly important I need to consider here. Do just remember, in general, when you're speaking, we want to try and emphasize our content words in English rather than our structure or our function words. Okay, so moving on to our first conditional. So remember that we use the first conditional to talk about possible and likely situations which are happening, which can happen now or in the future. Yeah, and we structure this with present aspect in our situation clause and future aspect in our consequence clause. So for example, unless you study, you won't pass, or if you work hard, you're going to succeed. So here we have our situation and the consequence of that. Remember again that we're talking about future aspect, not only will, because there's lots of different ways we can express the future in English. Here, this one's with will, this one's with going to. I could also use can, I can also use modals. Okay, so there's lots of different ways that we can express the future. Yeah, here's one with modals, for example. You might fail if you don't listen to me. Okay, in terms of pronunciation, if we're using will, we have to remember to contract it. Yeah, so it's not for example, imagine this was positive instead of negative. I wouldn't say you will pass, I'd say you'll pass. Okay, so we're always thinking about making that contraction with will. And if we're using going to, we also have that contraction, that connected speech of gonna. right? So it's not you are going to succeed, you're going to succeed. Yeah. So two aspects that we want to consider if we are pronouncing first conditionals. Remember, guys, the other really important thing about the first conditional is it's probably the one you are going to use the most. So if you're taking exams, we're always trying to use these more difficult structures like the second or the third conditional. But in real life, the English that you use in your day-to-day life, the structure in terms of conditionals, which is going to be much more common, is the first conditional or even the zero conditional. Yeah. And remember that we have lots of different ways that we express that. Whoops, there we go. So all of these ones here on the right are examples of future time clauses, yeah, which are very often used with the first conditional. Remember how important those words are because we use them for scheduling, for saying when things are going to happen. If you use English for work, this is language that's going to come up all the time. So it's, even though it's sometimes considered basic, it's really important because it gives you lots of, because it's really common, right? So basic language is sometimes considered less good, right? Not as good, but it's really important core vocabulary because we use it all the time because it is really common. You'll also see the first conditional used a lot with alternative structures like provided that or should with an inversion, and you'll see that more often in formal writing. So if you're writing any emails in English, these are good words to know. For example, the meeting will go ahead at 10 a.m. provided that the work has been completed on time. Okay, I could take away provided that and say if, and it would mean the same thing, but this is much better for the tone and the register of a formal email. If I was talking about should with an inversion, should you have any further questions, do not hesitate to contact me. That would be the same as saying if you have any further questions, do not hesitate to contact me. But again, it raises the tone and formality. So really great for formal emails. Okay, key points about our second conditional. We're using this to express hypothetical situations now or in the future. Yeah. So we construct this with our past simple or continuous in the situation clause, and then a variety of different modal verbs with an infinitive in the consequence clause. So I could use would, could, might, or may. For example, I'd buy a car if I won the lottery. If he was working more, he might have more money. Okay, now remember the same as we saw before with the first conditional, very often you're taught one structure in a grammar book, but when we're using language naturally, we tend to mix and, when we're using language naturally, we use a wide variety of these different kinds of modals, yeah? And these allow us to be much more expressive in what we want to say and allow us to be more speculative with our language as well. Okay. In terms of pronunciation, we need to be contracting would when it's working, for example, here as our modal verb. Okay, so I would buy a car, I'd buy a car. Yeah, it's unusual for us to not make that contraction. And if you're asking a question in the second conditional with you, would you like a drink? Would you buy a car if you won the lottery? Then we've got this pronunciation of the question form as well. Okay, would you? Would you buy a car? Okay, not would you buy, would you buy a car? We can also substitute other words in the second conditional, such as these examples here. Again, if you'd like to see that in more detail, I suggest going back to watch our second conditional video. And we also very often invert second conditionals to help our writing become more formal as well. So instead of saying, if he pushed the button, we'd all have problems, I can invert this with were he to push the button, we'd all have problems. Okay, our third conditional, key points to discuss here. We're using it to talk about hypothetical situations, but this time in the past. So that means things that didn't happen. Yeah. So our situation clause will be expressed with the past perfect simple or the past perfect continuous. And our consequence clause, again, can use all of these different modals, would, could, might, may, but to give it that past aspect, we're going to follow it with have and a participle. For example, I'd have arrived on time if I'd woken up earlier. Or if he'd worked harder, he might have had more money. Now, if you guys did our third conditional class, you'll remember that the pronunciation for the third conditional is really challenging, and a great one to try if you want to work on your pronunciation, because we have so many things that we have to contract. So in our, when we have had here, like in the situation clause, when had is the auxiliary, we need to contract it. And when we have would as our auxiliary, as our modal, in the consequence clause, we're going to contract it. And then have is also an auxiliary in the consequence clause, so we also contract it. So to give you an example, if we take that first one here, I would have arrived, I'd have arrived. Okay, I'd have arrived on time if I had woken up, if I'd woken up earlier. So that's our contraction of had here, and this is our contraction of would have. We also make that would you question form too, okay? So what would you have done? What would you have done if you'd woken up earlier? Okay, guys, now we also can make our inversions with the third conditional too if we want to have more formal writing, like here, like these 4 examples. It wasn't on your table, but I just want to very quickly remind you about how we use our mixed conditionals that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. So remember that the basic logic for a mixed conditional is if you have a hypothetical past situation, then you need to have a hypothetical present or future consequence. Yeah. So what that meant was that we mix third and second conditionals in order to express that. So for example, if I'd saved money last year, I'd buy a new car now. Yeah. This is my hypothetical past. The hypothetical result of that in the present is this, but neither of those things happened. Okay. If she hadn't met her husband, she'd still be single now. So in the past, this is my hypothetical consequence that didn't happen, and this is the hypothetical result of that now, which again didn't happen. So we use the third conditional part here and the second conditional part here. Okay, I'd have more energy if I hadn't gone to bed so late last night. Okay, so the same again. This is the consequence, the hypothetical consequence. This is the hypothetical situation. Okay, so let's summarize all of that information, guys, in your table. Yeah. So we're using the zero conditional to express facts and truths. We construct it using present aspect in the situation clause and present aspect in the consequence clause. And there's nothing really important that we need to think about when it comes to pronunciation. Our first conditional, that's to talk about possible and likely situations now or in the future. We construct that with present aspect in our situation clause and future aspect in our consequence clause. The pronunciation that we need to consider here is contraction of will and making the gonna instead of going to, contraction to. Our second conditional, guys, we're using hypothetical situations now or in the future. We construct that with the past simple or continuous in the situation clause. And then in our consequence clause, we can use a variety of modals with an infinitive verb. So would, could, might, or may, depending on how speculative we want to be. In terms of pronunciation, we need to contract would when it's functioning in the consequence clause. And if we're making questions with you, would you, we need to make that would you. And finally, the third conditional, this is to talk about hypothetical situations in the past, which means they did not happen. To construct that, we're using the past perfect simple or continuous in the situation clause. And in our consequence clause, those variety of modals again, would, could, might, or may, but instead of infinitive, this time we use have and the participle to express that past aspect. And in terms of pronunciation, this is the biggest challenge. We've got to contract all of these modal and auxiliary verbs So had in our situation clause, if he had worked, if he'd worked, and would and have come together in our consequence clause. I'd have arrived on time. I would also do it here, guys. So might, I won't contract, but I would contract have. He might have had. He might have had. Remember as well that you're making those blocks of sound. So it's not he might have had. We need to connect it all together. He might have had. Yeah, that's your block of sound. Okay, so think about when you were taking your notes at the beginning, where there were gaps in your knowledge, which parts you weren't very confident about, where you feel you could do a bit more practice. And I'd recommend going back and watching those specific videos. So, you know, if the second conditional still wasn't 100%, go and watch our second conditional video. And if you are studying with us, then you will have access to quite a few extra exercises that we're posting in our Google Classrooms today, along with all of these notes as well. Yeah. But do remember, despite all of these conditionals, the ones that you are really going to use the most are the first conditional and the zero conditional. Really, they're the most commonly used language.